Hey everyone, Nerdy Pastor back here, and wanted to do another video. It's been a while since I did one in my Presbyterian theologian series, but I've been meaning to do it for a while. I've been contemplating for the last 6 months or so who to dig in further to, and I've been thinking for a while about either doing William Swan Plummer or maybe Charles Hodge, but I've settled on William G.T. Shedd, and I wanted to share a little bit about his life and his writings today. And maybe in another video I'll do maybe next week, probably dig a little deeper into him as a theologian and his particular viewpoints and some more of his dogmatic theology. But I wanted to share a little bit about his life and his influence on me, and also just his writings, but a little bit about his very, very brief sketch, kind of some of his influence that he's kind of starting to have more today, and just a very brief overview of his writings and his work. And then maybe the next video I can kind of dig more into his dogmatic theology. But first, Shedd was born, I believe, in the 1820, and he lived till 1894. So he's, again, right there in the middle of the 19th century, was born in Massachusetts, was raised in a God-fearing household, was not converted, though, until a little later in his life. Started going to a Presbyterian church, though he was in the Congregational church for some years until they started to really move away from distinctive doctrines, and that was common, of course, in the Congregational church, especially in the 19th century. Is it the New Haven and of course the kind of neo, gets kind of a baggage term here, but Neo-Calvinism. It was more American Neo-Calvinism than the Dutch Neo-Calvinism, kind of the new Calvinism that was coming out of the New Haven theology school that was famous with Nathaniel Hopkins and Jonathan Edwards Jr. and other theologians in that area. Kind of greatly influenced the Congregational churches, and eventually, sadly, those churches turned into the Unitarian Church, and you saw the great distance that created. That it starts, unfortunately, with the New Haven theology, but that influenced the Congregational churches that Shedd was a part of, and was to some length was serving in. I think he had a pastorate for just a few years in a Congregational church. He worked, though, as an English professor for a number of years, along with being a pastor, and was a church historian as well. And I think he was a historian at Andover Seminary, if I remember. But he'd worked at a number of seminaries before eventually winding up at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And this is obviously way back when they were very conservative and theologically orthodox. Now they are wildly out there, way beyond anything even remotely orthodox. But William G.T. Shedd served at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and he was a professor of all sorts of practice and discipline. So he was an English literature professor for, I think, 7 years. He was a pastor for a couple years, went into the Presbyterian church a little bit after, I think it was in 1865, and then really for the rest of his life, the next 30-something years, he was a professor of church history, and then became in 1874 through 1890, became a professor of systematic theology at Union, and continued to do in his writing ministries until his death in 1894. And really what was a very conservative, old Calvinist, old Presbyterian, kind of old, kind of Princetonian. He was taught by men that were influenced, of course, by Hodge and others, and the old Princeton schools influence there. And so he was heavily influenced by old Princeton, but not kind of tethered to them. He was actually more influenced by Jonathan Edwards, apart from probably any other theologian, but I think he really very admired, I think, Hodge especially, though he disagreed with Hodge on a number of issues over the nature of kind of the transmission of sin, original sin. So in some secondary issues, he disagreed with Hodge, though he saw him as a incredible colleague, formidable theologian. So he's an interesting character because he kind of pulls from a lot of worlds. The world of English literature, the world of church history, systematic theology, pastoral theology. He was kind of very, in a lot of ways, very powerful preacher, and was a homiletics professor for a number of years. Wrote a really outstanding book on homiletics. I've read about half of it, and it's amazing. I'll give you some thoughts about that too, probably when I go over him as a theologian. But Shedd is kind of a Renaissance man. He's extremely learned. Very profoundly learned, and he's really known more because of all this. He's really a theologian and a philosopher and kind of a polymath in a way. Kind of reminds me of kind of Jonathan Edwards in that way, and also John Owen. Kind of a polymath in kind of the way they have such command over so many disciplines. And so Shedd is not to be trifled with. If you disagree with him, you have a lot to kind of come up against. And he's really, I think his biography is interesting because, again, he sticks in place just for some times. He really kind of jumps around a lot in his career until he ends up at Union for those last 25 years before he retires. But he's all over the place. I mean, he's taking professorships. He's an associate pastor. He's a professor of English, professor of church history, a professor of systematics. I mean, he's kind of all over the place, and in multiple denominations. So he's kind of an interesting person, though he never kind of travels off the continent. I don't believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but he doesn't seem to have any long stays in the continental Europe or anything like that, or in England. Seems like he's always in the New England area, Virginia, New England area, kind of the, northern Virginia, New England, kind of, that kind of area primarily in his life. So he's kind of localized and similar in a lot of ways to Jonathan Edwards. Edwards, I don't think, ever traveled outside of New England in his whole life either. So kind of a localized man, but global kind of in his learning, and kind of a polymath in his command of subject matter as well. He's really kind of more of a philosophical theologian, has a razor-sharp understanding of reason and logic, and just incisive kind of writer. I can only imagine how he would preach. Probably very, very lucid, extremely razor-sharp. But he seems, when I've read a lot of his sermons and a lot of his pithier writings, he's extremely kind of punchy, and just he kind of really incises his words. It's just profound just to read. I can only imagine what it's like when you would hear him. So he's learned, he's lucid, he's a polymath in many ways. He was 74 years of age when he died, I think 1820, 1894, was at multiple institutions, 3 institutions, I believe, in his teaching career. Spent about 30 of his years or so at Union in New York. And again, this is during, this is in a time where he's in a more conservative institution, of course, but he also was engaged in some of the controversies of the day, especially at the turn of the century. For those of you that know American Presbyterian history, it's famous during this time where there was multiple discussions about revising the Westminster Confession of Faith, and for a time it was. They added essentially a number of chapters to basically kind of untether the importance of how the doctrines tied together, and to, in a sense, kind of make the love of God and the Holy Spirit kind of this universal spirit and the universal love of God, and those things are very clear already in the confession, but it kind of destabilized the confession, and it really opened up to destabilizing really the system of Calvinism, and that's, again, part of the influence of New Haven theology, the influence of liberal theology, certainly making its intrusions into the Westminster Confession of Faith. Warfield was famous for in a sense he stood against it, but it kept happening, and then it finally was passed, if I remember, 1903, and then of course it was when there was a split. Of course, the standards were restated, and the confession was put back together as the way it was before. So, but he was a part of that controversy against the standards and was resisting that. I think like Warfield was, but a little bit more adamant against it than even Warfield was. And then also was involved in the heresy trials of Charles Briggs, an Old Testament scholar who really was giving into the German liberalism and the modernity of the day that led to, of course, the fundamentalist liberal controversy in the 1920s and 30s that led to great J. Gresham Machen and splitting from Princeton and creating Westminster Seminary in 1930s, late 1930s, and of course all of that was kind of part of the same kind of season of theological life in the Northeast of America, and had a huge impact upon American evangelical and Presbyterian polity and theology and culture as well. So Shedd's really important in these ways. His biography kind of overlaps with very important seismic activities in America, from the Civil War to Reconstruction period evolving modernity and liberalism in American Christianity. And really his works are kind of over those periods of time. He had works from about the 1860s, 1858 I think is the earliest one, maybe a little earlier than that, 1856, all the way to 1893, 1894. I mean, he wrote for a long time. So he's overlapping in all this period. And you also think if that's during Vatican I in 1870. That's also during the many kind of writings of Darwin and evolution. I mean, this is very kind of a hotbed of controversy during this time. So he has a lot to say just in his writings and his life during this period. And in the last few years, probably the last 15 or 20 years, I guess it'd be the last 25 because of when the Dogmatic Theology was published, I think in 2003. But his writings have had kind of a renaissance. And, it's kind of under the radar because he's not talked about a whole lot. But all of his writings have been published again, which is just fantastic. Of course, the most important is Alan Gomes' editing and putting together of his 3-volume that he wrote in 1888 through 1894, Dogmatic Theology. And he puts it into one volume here, 3rd edition. Okay, and so it's the 3rd edition, but it's a 1-volumed 3rd edition. And what's great about Gomes is, again, you can watch the videos I have where I comment on Shed, but he does a great job of putting in tons of supplemental materials, edit notes in it as well, and he also gives explanatory kind of endnotes to each chapter to kind of explain some of Shed's thinking. But that's probably his most important, for sure, his most important work. But there's been a lot of publishing of his works for some time, but most recently, all of it's been kind of coming forth, but it's not been highlighted or kind of praised in the way maybe other theologians have. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, because of how formidable and in many ways traditional of a theologian he is to old Calvinism and Presbyterianism. But it's probably just for some reason he's just not caught on as much. However, he had a monograph put out back in, I think it was, early 2010s or maybe a little bit earlier than that, by Oliver Crisp, who's kind of a well-known systematic kind of philosophical theologian, not necessarily the most conservative, but not liberal either. He's more of like a critical scholar, and he's a systematic theologian. But he wrote this that I saw when I was finishing up in seminary, and I think I bought this in 2010, and it's called An American Augustinian. And so Crisp kind of engages with William G.T. Shedd. And I remember seeing that come out. I think this came out in 2007, so when it came out. So right when I was finishing up, kind of getting into seminary, midway through. And I remember seeing that, and I was really interested in, like, wow, there's contemporary, cutting-edge kind of theologians that are resourcing William G.T. Shedd for current discussions on salvation and sin. How cool. And it just shows how relevant Shedd is. He really spends an immense amount of time unpacking the crucial, like central doctrines of Christianity, but in this kind of razor sharp way, with kind of almost imaginative ways of speaking, and then also highly incisive, rational, reasonable ways of thinking, biblical, historical ways of thinking, literature-oriented ways of including tons of humanist writers and Greek philosophers and church fathers at the same time. I mean, he's just kind of incredible in this way. And so he's known for a lot of his works, which again, I'll spend more time in another video talking about that. But, just seeing all of his books being published at the same time, a theologian like Crisp putting together some thoughts about that and really giving a full treatment to his theology in a contemporary light is really interesting. Again, the Dogmatic Theology being published as one volume by P&R a number of years ago, about 20 years ago, is very important as well. I went to I'll finish with this. I went to a conference in March with Kevin DeYoung and John Piper and Joel Beakey and a number of other wonderful Carl Truman and H.B. Charles and a number of wonderful speakers and pastors. And it was fascinating when Dr. DeYoung got up there. He was giving away William G.T. Shedd's Systematic Theology for free, for basically kind of a giveaway contest. And he had like 10 volumes of it. He had 10 copies of it giving it away because he wanted people to read Shed. And I found that really interesting that Dr. DeYoung, who's did his dissertation on John Witherspoon, who was, I think, the first president of Princeton and very formative in the American Revolution time, early Presbyterianism in America. Obviously highly kind of influenced by the Puritan movement. But he was giving away William G.T. Shedd. I was interested by that, and shows, I think, Shedd is becoming more influential and more popular in, I think, the ways he speaks in his time against the universalism of his day, which is even more rampant now. Again, kind of anti-hell views, kind of conditional hell views, talking about basically anti-penal substitution views. I mean, he spends huge amounts of time in his systematic theology emphasizing the justice of God, the holiness of God, the penal substitutionary atonement of Christ, the doctrine of eternal endless punishment in hell, and just these incredibly incisive, tight, power-packed chapters on these areas. I think that's probably why he's becoming not just published, but more relevant even now, because these are the same fights that we are having that he was in his day, but I would think in ours it's even more widespread for sure. So I think his life, his writings, kind of when he lived and when he wrote, really have a whole lot of relevance for ours as well. And his biography is kind of interesting. And again, he had 4 children. He was married at the time of his death, was an old school Presbyterian, went from kind of a liberalized denomination in Congregationalism kind of to the more conservative, went through some controversies with the Presbyterian Church at the time, like many others did, was alive during Vatican I, was alive during Charles Darwin's writings, was alive during, the evolution kind of teachings that were growing popularity, Origin of Species, wrote tons of systematic works, has tons of sermons. I mean, his writings are about 10 or 12 volumes, not huge, but substantial. And so I'll talk a little bit more about those next time, most importantly about his dogmatic theology, his as a theologian, what he enters in with that. But William G.T. Shedd is absolutely outstanding. And I want to commend him to you for his theology, and I think life well lived for the Lord Jesus as well. So someone to really take in and to consider and to have careful study of his writings. We'll talk more about that next time.